I have a Nikon Nikkor S Auto 35mm 2.8 lens here that I'm going to be disassembling. This lens is a little bit more difficult to take apart than some other ones. It's nice in that you can remove all the body sections and clean those individually, but the mechanical setup with the diaphragm internally and the focusing mechanism specifically, I found to be a bit of a challenge to take apart. I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens to get access to the diaphragm, optics, and the body sections on their own. My particular copy I have here, you can notice that it has some haze and internally there's corrosion as well, but it has the exact same setup as a normal lens. Just internally it does have some signs of damage. So starting off here, we'll go in from the front of the lens, and first off we have the name ring going around here. And the name ring on the front of the lens is not actually what we are going to remove at this stage, but next to the name ring there's a second black ring which has two little divots for a spanning wrench on the exterior there. The name ring itself is actually part of the front optical piece, which allows you to then remove the first element. So this is going to remove the entire front optical group, and you can see the corrosion in there. But the name ring itself is part of this, and it doesn't have any divots for a spanning wrench on it, but to actually remove the first element here, and if you wanted to try to clean inside of here, you can undo this name ring by undoing it here. It just unscrews. And that exposes the first element, which then can be lifted out of place. And you can do the same on the back element here. There's a little cap section on the back that just unscrews, so you can clean inside the optics a little bit on this lens fairly easily. And that exposes the front of the diaphragm here. Because the diaphragm on this lens is rusty, you can't actually see it completely. It's just kind of off to the edge there. Let me stop this down a little. There we go. You can see the blades are not really lining up properly. One actually is out of position and the other one has a little bit of a hole in it. But you can actually clean the diaphragm if there was just oil or something on it in this current state pretty well. But now we're going from the back and get access to the back of the lens as well. So on the back, you have these 5 screws going around here on the back section mounting plate. Undo these to lift off the mounting plate. So this entire mounting plate will now slide out. It's a little bit stuck on mine. There we go. So the mounting plate has the stop down lever over on this side, which is moving smoothly in place and springing back into position thanks to this little spring over here. And then there are a bunch of ball bearings in the behind the mount section over here. And that is exposed the back optic here, so we can better access it, and the back of the diaphragm mechanism on the inside here, and then the top of the aperture control ring. So to get access to the back of the diaphragm, we're going to undo this back optic here, and it has this saucer-shaped ring going around the edge here, which has 2 holes for a pointed tip spanning wrench. You can also use a screwdriver to loosen this up. That removes the entire back optic. And much like on the front optic, it has a cap on the back section here that you can undo pretty easily. So you can just undo this cap and then remove the first optic or first element in there. And then also on the back section, it has 2 little divots for a spanning wrench on either side here, so you can undo that ring that's going around there and then clean the element on that section as well. So now we have access to both sides of the diaphragm, and if there's just a little bit of oil on there, you can actually clean it pretty well in this current state because both sides of the diaphragm are exposed and the blades are not too fragile if yours are not all rusty like these ones are. So now we'll actually go in and get access to the body sections and remove the diaphragm fully and get access to the focusing mechanism as well. So going in here from the back, first off we have the aperture control ring going around here. So it just is slid in place currently, so we can pop that off. Oh, actually there is a little screw over here that's locking it in, actually coupling it into the lens. So there's one screw on the back section. So this long screw, I have to undo that, and then it just goes out of place. There's no ball bearing or anything to actually provide the clicking sound on this lens. It has the grooves on the aperture control ring over here, and those are hitting up against the little clicker thing here. So this is what actually provides the clicking sound and locks the aperture at specific positions, unlike many other lenses use a ball bearing for that. So next up, we'll start removing some of the various body sections in here. So first up, we can remove this main body section in here. So this one is the focusing ring, and it just is held in place by 3 black screws going around. You undo those and then slide it out of place. So that removes the focusing ring there. You can see that it's completely separate from all the mechanical parts on the inside, so it can be cleaned pretty well. Next up, we have this top silver ring here, which is what the filters would normally screw into. And it just screws in place, but there's a little slotted screw right here that's keeping it locked in place, so it doesn't normally, you're not able to easily rotate it around normally. So we'll just loosen up this screw here. And then grab this top section and unscrew it. So there's that ring as well. Now we have the ring here, the last body section really, with the depth of field scale on it. And this one is held in place by 3 little silver screws going around on it. So undo those, and then it also slides off of the top of the lens. There's another body ring there. Now we have the entire focusing mechanism and diaphragm assembly exposed. They're fairly well integrated on this lens, so it's a little bit of a pain to take them apart. That's now what we're going to do, is actually separate out the diaphragm mechanism from the focusing mechanism completely. So with the diaphragm mechanism in the middle here, 2 things are currently preventing it from actually being removed fully. So as we rotate this back and forth and focus up and down, first off, you'll notice this bar here on the exterior of the diaphragm. And this one is actually preventing you from, it limits how far you can focus in either direction. So when we focus to the extreme in this direction, the bar hits up against this other bar on this side. When you go to the other direction over here, hits the other side of that bar. So we'll remove that first to actually prevent, to stop the limiting of how far you can focus in either direction. It is attached by 2 little slotted screws here and here. Now we can actually focus beyond where we could before, but there's also something else limiting how far we can focus, and that is this little track system down here. So this little track, you can see, is, as I focus in and out here, there's this little post moving along that, and it's actually coupled to the inside of the focusing mechanism, and it's what keeps, as I rotate this outer ring back and forth, it keeps the intersection stationary so that it just focuses up and down and moves in and out. So, and if I focus too far, it hits the 2 extremes, so we can't actually remove the diaphragm at this stage. So to remove this piece, first off, there's the little top slotted screw right here, and then if you look down between these 2 holes, or going through the 2 holes here, you can actually see that there's 2 Phillips head screws below there, and that actually removes the entire piece. So first off, we'll remove this little top flat screw, and then the 2 below it as well, which are, you have it lined up properly so you can see them through the 2 holes here. All right, and now this permits us to actually take this focusing mechanism here and just unscrew it further past where we could before and undo it entirely from the outer section of the focusing mechanism, which will have the little track system piece still in it. So we've separated those 2 rings. Now we have the diaphragm mechanism here, which we also can separate from the rest of the focusing mechanism here. So with this piece, we can then remove the diaphragm mechanism. There's nothing holding it in place any longer. It just pops out if you press on the back section here. And the diaphragm itself will just pop right out of place. And then you have the exterior part of the focusing mechanism as well. So taking a look here at the diaphragm, even though this is not operating correctly, I can just describe how you would actually take it apart and repair it if you needed to and actually get access to the individual blades. It seems like that the diaphragm is held in place by 3 little screws going around on the exterior here, which are holding in the top plate. And once you would undo that, I imagine that you'd be able to actually get in and access the diaphragm. I wasn't actually able to do that on this copy, but I think that's just because everything's all rusted together here. Looking at how the diaphragm is operated and how the aperture is controlled, we have two things. We have the stop-down lever control and then the aperture control ring, which is controlling it as well. So the aperture control ring is in this longer groove over here. So this post moves back and forth and actually limits how far the aperture can open and close. So it's moving the curve along inside the diaphragm down here. And then the stop-down lever would normally be held open, or closed, so it's that the diaphragm is closed like this, and then you can hit it so it goes open as well. And it also holds the post inside here against the aperture control ring. This is not actually happening, the holding it open is happening in the mounting plate back here rather than on the diaphragm itself. So that's how that operates. That pretty much covers the disassembly section of this lens. You can see we have the various optics here, separate from the body sections, which can all be removed and cleaned individually, which is a nice feature of this lens. And then all the mechanical parts like the mounting plate and then the diaphragm and the various focusing rings. So putting back together the lens, by far the hardest part is getting the focusing mechanism back in place correctly so that all the various rings and things are lining up and that the various body sections are fitting together correctly. So starting here on the reassembly, first off we're going to get the focusing mechanism back in position. So here's the outer part of the focusing mechanism, this black ring, and the inner part, this silver ring. And these two are just going to screw back together. The challenge is that these have to lock together in the correct orientation. You can screw them together in a lot of different orientations, but only if you do it in the correct one will things actually correctly line up. So on my copy there are these pairs of little lines right here, and those line up so that when this is fully focused in, that these lines are going to be lined up. And then there's this third little line right over here, and that one kind of indicates where we should screw these back together to start with. And during the disassembly, if your lens does not have something like this, it's best that you make little lines or something or marks that can actually indicate how these are going to go and fit back together. So now we'll just screw these two sections back together. And you can see that the lines are properly lining up here. But when I focus in and out here, you'll notice that the intersection is spinning around, which is not what we want. We want the intersection to be stationary, the silver section, and then only the middle section to actually rotate back and forth. So both the intersection and the outer section are going to be stationary. Intersection is going to move up and down when we focus in and out. What's actually doing that is the track system right here. So this track couples the inner focusing mechanism to the outermost focusing mechanism so that it can move up and down. And part of that is this little piece here, this metal piece. This is going to go into the lens with the bar going upwards and actually lock this in place so that the intersection doesn't rotate around. So I'm going to focus out again until it's almost unscrewed here. And then I'm going to take this track piece and pop it into the inside of the lens behind the silver ring on the inside. Then I'm going to just focus back in. And I'm going to be looking at the intersection here through these two screw holes to find where, so these two black screw holes, you want to find where the screw holes for all three of these pieces line up properly. And then we'll use the two little Phillips head screws to reattach them. You may have to rotate the intersection and outer section back and forth a little bit to find the correct lineup. And then to complete this piece, reattach this one little slotted screw that goes in the top of the focusing mechanism, or the focusing track there. Alright, so now when I focus back and forth, notice that these two, the silver section and the black section here, remained fixed relative to each other with rotation, but the silver section moves up and down. So next up we have to reinstall the diaphragm mechanism itself. So here's the diaphragm, and to get this back in place, two things have to line up. First off, on the diaphragm there's this little silver screw right here, and that is going to line up with the notch in the intersection of the focusing mechanism down there so that it's locked in place and doesn't rotate around as well. We also have to ensure that we're lining up the, or coupling in the aperture control ring here at this stage. So on this back focusing mechanism here, there's a piece that we previously did not remove because you almost never would need to unless it's moving stiffly. It's this little fork piece, and it's actually a separate piece that's held in place by a retaining ring. So you can remove that and clean it or add lubricant if you need, but in this case what we want to do is make sure that this retaining ring with the fork, which is going to be controlled by the aperture control ring, is hooking in correctly to the diaphragm into this little post right here. So this post is going to go onto the fork of that ring down there. So we're going to line up these two components, the little silver screw and the post. Kind of just look at it visually from the top and see if things are lining up. You can get the post in the fork first and then get the other one lined up after that by rotating it around. Alright, so that looks good. Now just press these two back together. And then to limit how far we can focus in either direction, we have this next metal piece here, this curvy metal piece, which is going to go and hit on either side of this metal piece in the section here to limit how far we can focus in either direction. So it just is going to go into the two screw holes going around the inner part of the focusing mechanism there and there. Alright, so now when we focus back and forth between the two extremes here, you should see it hitting up against either side, and so that we can't actually focus too far in either direction. So this is a good point to start installing some of the body sections as well, because you can actually see what's going on inside the lens. So first off, we have the aperture control ring right here, and we want to make sure that when we installed the diaphragm originally, there's this slot over on the main body section, and there should be a little kind of cutout on the intersection here that you can move back and forth. So those two should be lined up, and if you did the lining up of the fork correctly before, that's where things should be lining up. For this aperture control ring, it has a little screw hole on the back that a long screw is going to go into, and that's going to go through the aperture control ring into that little slot down there and actually couple these two together. And then the grooves over on the aperture control ring right down here, those are also going to line up with the little snapper thing right here to make that clicking sound. But mainly getting the screw hole lined up with the slot in the other piece is the big challenge. It's going to line those up and then just push the aperture control ring on top. Once that's on, you can't really see too well down into the aperture control ring below, but hopefully that's still lined up. So reinstall that large screw to actually go down into the diaphragm and couple these two together. And if you meet resistance, then it's probably not lined up correctly, so I'm going to retry. So I got it that time, and now on a normal lens, turning this back and forth would adjust the aperture control ring. There's still nothing holding the diaphragm open, so it would stay in its current position, but if you press down the little lever over on this side, you should see that turning the aperture control ring opens and closes the diaphragm. Next up on the back section, just to complete that, we'll reinstall the back optic here. So it just screws in place. And we can lock it down with a spanning wrench in the two little holes on either side. And then we have the entire mounting plate. And the mounting plate has the stop-down lever and the spring that's actually holding the diaphragm open in its default state. So this mounting plate, it's getting coupled into the diaphragm through this fork on the back section here. You can see that when I move the stop-down lever, the fork moves back and forth. And then it springs back open with the spring on the inside. That fork is going onto the fork on the inside here. There's this little fork over here, which is actually controlling the aperture directly. And you can see it moving back and forth there. So those two need to line up. And once those line up, all the screw holes that go around this should also line up. So we'll just reattach these two now with the 5 screws going around there. Now we have the front to take care of, so let me put on a name ring or a back lens cap there. So just reinstalling the various front rings going in here. So first off, we have this silver ring, which is going to screw into the front section. To make sure it doesn't turn around on its own, we'd lock it down with the little screw right here. Next up, we have the silver ring here with the depth of field scale on it. So we're going to just line this up so that it's going over near the numbers on the aperture control ring here with the little dot, the black dot there. And then we also want to line up the 3 screw holes on this ring so that they line up with the ones down there. So just slide this in place, get it roughly lined up first, and then reattach it using the 3 little silver screws here. And the final body section is the focusing ring. So this one just going to focus all the way in here on the interior, and then find where the infinity indicator is on this. And this is also going to go over by the black line and the black dot over here, and it should line up so that the screw holes on the black intersection of the focusing ring, the part that actually moves around, line up with the ones in here. So get this lined up. Okay, and then that reattaches with the 3 black screws. And finally, to complete the reassembly, just install this front optic as well. So it just screws in place. And we can lock it down using a spanning wrench. Alright, so that has the reassembly of this lens all complete. You can make sure that it's focusing properly between the 2 extremes of 0.3 meters and infinity, that the aperture control is working. Obviously on this lens with the corroded shutter blades, it's not really going to work properly, but you can make sure that it's working on your copy and that the stop down lever here on the back is also working. So this lens is really kind of a mixed bag. It's nice in that you can actually take it apart and get all the body sections individually and clean those and make repairs pretty easily, but it also has some really annoying things. I found that the way that the diaphragm and the focusing mechanism are getting coupled together can be really difficult to actually put back together and take apart the first time if you don't know what you're doing, and especially if you don't make the correct marks on the inner part of the diaphragm or inner part of the focusing mechanism to know how it screws back together. You can spend quite a bit of time just messing around and trying to find the correct alignment. It also uses what feels like a lot cheaper components than some other similar aged lenses. Like the exterior, it just feels like a lighter weight and cheaper metal, and then it uses these slotted screws that I know my copy is all corroded and stuff, but the slotted screws were like easy to break as well on this particular lens, much more so than on some other lenses. So it definitely does have some annoyances when you're taking it apart that you have to be careful of. So if you have a copy of this lens that you want to make some repairs on, it's easy enough to actually get access to the diaphragm and the optics and make some minor repairs, but for more involved things where you have to take apart the focusing mechanism and get access to the diaphragm and take out the individual blades and clean those, it's a more, any repairs are going to be more involved, and there's more potential to actually mess it up than on some comparable lenses.